The morning sun peeked through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport as James Wilson walked confidently through Terminal B. His crisp navy uniform with 4 gold stripes on each sleeve marked him as a captain for Skyway Airlines. At 35, James had worked incredibly hard to become one of the few black commercial airline pilots at the company. Today was just another workday for him, flight SK-285 from Atlanta to San Francisco. James checked his watch. He was 2 hours early, just as he always liked to be. There was something calming about having extra time to prepare, to check the flight plans, and to get to know his crew before takeoff. His polished shoes clicked against the shiny floor as he made his way toward the staff entrance. excuse me, sir," a sharp voice called from behind. James turned around to see a flight attendant hurrying toward him. She was in her mid-40s with shoulder-length blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. Her name tag read, Patricia Summers. "Can I help?" "You?" James asked with a friendly smile. Patricia stopped in front of him, slightly out of breath. Her eyes narrowed as she looked him up and down. "I need to see your ID, please." James blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He was fully dressed, in his captain's uniform with his credentials visible, including his photo ID hanging around his neck. This wasn't the usual protocol when entering the staff area. "Of course," he said evenly, though a familiar weight settled in his stomach. He'd been through this before. James reached for his airline ID and held it out to her. Patricia took it, turning it over in her hands and examining it closely, far more closely than James had seen her examine other crew members' IDs. The terminal bustled around them, other airline staff walking past with curious glances. "I haven't seen you before," Patricia said, still holding his ID. "Are you new to Skyway?" "I've been with Skyway for 7 years," James replied. "I usually fly the New York route, but I'm covering the San Francisco flight today." Patricia frowned slightly. "I've been working here for 12 years and I've never seen you. I just need to double-check this, you understand, right? We can't be too careful these days." James noticed 2 other crew members watching the interaction from a few feet away. One was Lisa Chen, a flight attendant he had worked with several times before. She looked uncomfortable but remained silent. The other was Robert Taylor, a ground crew member who was also watching with a furrowed brow. "Is there a problem here?" Robert finally asked, stepping forward. Patricia jumped slightly, as if surprised by the interruption. "No problem, just doing my job, making sure everyone is who they say they are." "That's Captain Wilson," Robert said firmly. "He's one of our best pilots." James could feel his heart beating a little faster, the familiar mix of frustration and resignation washing over him. He kept his expression neutral, professional. He had learned long ago that showing any sign of irritation in these situations only made things worse. Patricia's cheeks flushed slightly. She handed the ID back to James, but her expression remained skeptical. "Well, I haven't worked with him before. Just being thorough." "You didn't stop Captain Henderson when he walked through 10 minutes ago," Lisa said quietly, finally joining the conversation. "He wasn't wearing his ID at all." The implication hung in the air. Captain Henderson was white. Patricia's flush deepened. "That's different. I know Dave Henderson." James tucked his ID back into his pocket. "It's fine. Security is important." His voice was calm, but inside, a storm of emotions churned. This wasn't his first encounter with this kind of treatment, and he knew it wouldn't be his last. But today was supposed to be a good day. His father, Thomas Wilson, CEO of Wilson Global Enterprises, was in town for business, and they had plans to meet up in San Francisco after the flight. "I need to prepare for my flight now," James said, his tone professional but distant. "If you'll excuse me." He walked past Patricia, conscious of the eyes on his back. As he pushed through the door to the staff area, he heard Robert say something to Patricia in a low, angry voice. James didn't turn around to see her response. The pilot's lounge was quiet when James entered. He sat down heavily in one of the plush chairs and took a deep breath. 7 years with Skyway, over 10,000 flight hours, a perfect safety record, and still this happened. He pulled out his phone and was about to text his father when another pilot walked in. "Hey, James. Good to see you, man." It was David Wong, one of the few pilots James considered a friend at the airline. "David, hey," James said, quickly pocketing his phone and standing up to shake David's hand. "Didn't know you were flying today. Just got in from Chicago. Heading home now." David paused, studying James's face. "You okay? You look like you just had to sit through one of those terrible safety briefing updates." James hesitated. David was one of the good ones. But explaining these situations was always exhausting. Sometimes it was easier to just let it go. "It's nothing," James said finally. "Just the usual. Patricia Summers stopped me at the entrance, demanded to see my ID, acted like I didn't belong here." David's expression darkened. "Patricia? Again? Man, she did the same thing to Aisha from catering last month. This is getting ridiculous." "It is what it is," James said with a shrug that carried the weight of 1,000 similar incidents. "No, it's not what it is. It's not okay." David ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Have you reported it?" James gave him a look. They both knew what happened when these things were reported. Best case scenario, nothing. Worst case, he'd be labeled as difficult or overly sensitive. "Right, stupid question," David muttered. "Want me to say something?" "I'm heading to a meeting with scheduling and Reynolds will be there. I could bring it up." Reynolds was the head of crew management, and he and David had gone to flight school together. James considered the offer for a moment, but shook his head. "Thanks. But no, I've got a good flight today. San Francisco, weather looks clear, full passenger list but not oversold. I just want to focus on that." David looked like he wanted to argue but nodded instead. "All right. But this shouldn't keep happening. James, it's 2025 for crying out loud. Tell me about it," James said with a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. After David left, James sat down to review his flight plan. The incident with Patricia still lingered in his mind, but he pushed it aside. He'd become an expert at compartmentalizing these experiences, tucking them away so they didn't interfere with his job. He checked the passenger manifest and noticed a VIP was booked in first class, just listed as corporate executive. Probably some tech CEO heading to Silicon Valley, James thought. Skyway had been trying to court more corporate clients lately, offering special packages for business travelers. James didn't know that the VIP was much closer to home than any tech executive. His father, Thomas Wilson, had changed his plans and booked a seat on James's flight as a surprise. Thomas had a meeting with Skyway's executives the next day. His company was considering becoming one of their biggest corporate clients. He thought it would be nice to fly with his son at the controls, to see him in his element before the big meeting. As James left the lounge to begin his pre-flight checks, he passed Patricia again. She was at the crew briefing area, chatting and laughing with some other flight attendants. When she saw him, her smile faltered slightly, but she quickly looked away, pretending not to notice him. James straightened his shoulders and walked past her. He had a job to do. Passengers who trusted him to get them safely to their destination. He wouldn't let Patricia's behavior distract him from that. But as he headed toward the gate, he couldn't help wondering how many more times he would have to prove he belonged in the uniform he wore with such pride. What James didn't know was that his father's presence on today's flight would change everything. Not just for him, but for Patricia Summers and Skyway Airlines as a whole. As the morning sun continued to rise over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the terminal floor, the stage was set for a confrontation that had been years in the making. James Wilson settled into the captain's seat in the cockpit of the Boeing 737. His fingers moved expertly across the control panel, flipping switches and checking gauges as part of his pre-flight routine. Despite the encounter with Patricia earlier, he felt at home here. The cockpit was his space, a place where his skills mattered more than the color of his skin. The door opened behind him and his co-pilot for the day walked in. Alex Rivera was relatively new to Skyway Airlines but had years of experience from his time in the Air Force. "Morning, Captain," Alex said, sliding into the seat beside James. "Beautiful day for flying, isn't it?" James nodded, appreciating Alex's straightforward manner. "Couldn't ask for better weather. How are you doing today?" "Can't complain," Alex replied, beginning his own pre-flight checks. "Though I heard there was some kind of issue at the staff entrance." James's hands paused briefly over the controls. News traveled fast in airports. Nothing major, just a misunderstanding. Alex glanced at him, clearly picking up on the tension in James's voice. Lisa Chen told me what happened. That flight attendant, Patricia, she had no right to question you like that. James sighed. He'd hoped to put the incident behind him, but it seemed determined to follow him into the cockpit. It happens more often than you'd think. That doesn't make it right, Alex said, his jaw tightening. You've been flying longer than most Opal here have been with the airline. I appreciate the support, but right now I just want to focus on getting everyone safely to San Francisco. James turned back to the control panel, effectively ending that line of conversation. Alex seemed to understand and change the subject. Did you see we have a VIP on board today? Some big corporate executive. They've got the head of customer relations in a spin. James remembered seeing that on the manifest. Any idea who it is? No name provided, just that they're important. Probably another tech billionaire. Alex shrugged. I heard Skyway's been trying to land some big corporate accounts. This might be part of that. James nodded, his mind briefly flickering to his father. Thomas Wilson wasn't just any CEO. He was the head of Wilson Global Enterprises, a company with interests in everything from tech to transportation. Skyway would certainly be interested in having them as a client. James couldn't help but smile at the thought of his dad sitting in meetings with airline executives, his sharp business mind assessing their proposals. Outside the cockpit, the cabin, crew was preparing for boarding. Patricia Summers had been assigned as the lead flight attendant for the first-class cabin. She moved efficiently, checking seat pockets and making sure everything was in perfect order. But her movements were slightly stiffer than usual, her smile a bit forced. Lisa Chen, working in the main cabin, kept throwing glances toward Patricia. The incident with Captain Wilson had left a bad taste in her mouth. She'd worked with James several times and had always found him to be professional, kind, and an excellent pilot. Patricia's behavior toward him had been completely uncalled for. Is everything okay? Asked Damon Johnson, another flight attendant working the main cabin. You seem distracted. Lisa hesitated. Damon was new, having joined Skyway only 3 months ago. She wasn't sure how much to share. Just thinking about something that happened earlier. Patricia stopped Captain Wilson at the staff entrance, demanded to see his ID, acted like he didn't belong here. Damon frowned. The captain? Why would she do that? Lisa gave him a pointed look. Oh, Damon said, understanding dawning on his face. That's not right. No, it's not, Lisa agreed. And it's not the first time she's done something like this. Last month, she questioned Aisha from catering, made her show her badge 3 times before letting her into the crew area. Has anyone reported her? Damon asked. Lisa sighed. What would be the point? Nothing ever happens, and then we get labeled as troublemakers. Back in the cockpit, James and Alex continued with their preparations, going through the checklist, methodically. James felt the familiar sense of calm that always came over him when he was getting ready for a flight. Whatever happened outside this space, in here, he was in control. Ground control to Skyway 285, you are cleared for pushback in 20 minutes, came the voice over the radio. Skyway 285 acknowledged. Ready for pushback in 20, James responded. Alex glanced at his watch. Boarding should be starting right about now. Sure enough, the sound of the boarding announcement came faintly through the cockpit door. James knew that soon, the quiet of the empty plane would be replaced by the hustle of passengers finding their seats, stowing their luggage, and settling in for the 5-hour flight to San Francisco. In the jet bridge, Patricia stood at the entrance to the plane, greeting passengers with a practiced smile. Welcome aboard Skyway Airlines Flight 285 to San Francisco. May I see your boarding pass, please? The first-class passengers began to board, each receiving Patricia's polite but somewhat mechanical welcome. She was still distracted by the earlier incident. A part of her felt uncomfortable about how she had treated Captain Wilson, but another part of her felt justified. After all, she hadn't recognized him. It was her job to be vigilant, wasn't it? Her thoughts were interrupted by the approach of an older black man in an expensive charcoal suit. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and walked with the confident air of someone used to being in charge. "Good morning," Thomas Wilson said, handing over his boarding pass. "Lovely day for flying." Patricia scanned the boarding pass, noting the first-class seat assignment. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Wilson. You're in seat 2A on the left side just past the galley." Thomas smiled warmly. "Thank you. I'm looking forward to this flight. I understand Captain James Wilson is in command today." Patricia's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, that's correct. Do you know the captain?" Thomas's eyes twinkled with a hint of amusement. "You could say that. He's my son." Patricia felt her heart skip a beat. She tried to maintain her professional composure, but her mind was racing. The captain's father? And judging by his expensive suit and first-class ticket, not just any father. "I see," she managed to say. "I hope you enjoy your flight, Mr. Wilson." "I'm sure I will," Thomas replied, his smile never wavering. "My son is an excellent pilot." As Thomas made his way down the aisle to his seat, Patricia stood frozen for a moment. The realization of who she had just met, and what she had done earlier, was beginning to sink in. But there was no time to dwell on it. Other passengers were waiting to board. In first class, Thomas settled into his seat, placing his briefcase under the seat in front of him. He was looking forward to surprising James after the flight. They hadn't seen each other in person for a few months, though they spoke regularly by phone. Thomas was immensely proud of his son's accomplishments, knowing all too well the barriers James had faced in his career. Back in the cockpit, James and Alex were completing the final items on their checklist. The plane was almost fully boarded, and they would be pushing back from the gate soon. James felt a sense of anticipation building, not just for the flight itself, but for seeing his father in San Francisco later. "Captain?" Patricia's voice came through the intercom from the cabin. James pressed the button to respond. "Yes?" There was a brief pause. "All passengers are boarded and secured. We're ready when you are." "Thank you," James replied, keeping his tone professional. "We'll be pushing back shortly." He couldn't see Patricia's face, but something in her voice had sounded odd, almost nervous. James brushed it off. He had more important things to focus on right now. The ground crew gave the all-clear signal, and the plane began to push back from the gate. James felt the familiar thrill that came with the start of every flight. For the next 5 hours, he would be responsible for safely transporting over 150 people across the country. It was a responsibility he took seriously, and a job he loved, despite everything. In the cabin, Patricia was helping a passenger stow a bag in the overhead compartment when Lisa approached her. "Patricia, can I talk to you for a minute?" Lisa asked quietly. Patricia looked annoyed at the interruption, but followed Lisa to the galley area. "What is it?" "We're about to take off." "Do you know who that man is in 2A? Lisa asked, nodding toward Thomas Wilson. "He said he's the captain's father," Patricia replied, trying to sound casual. "Why?" "He's not just the captain's father," Lisa said. "I overheard him on the phone while boarding. He's Thomas Wilson, CEO of Wilson Global Enterprises, one of the biggest companies in the country." Patricia felt the blood drain from her face. Wilson Global Enterprises was a household name, a massive conglomerate with billions in annual revenue. And she had just treated the CEO's son like he didn't belong in a pilot's uniform. "Are you sure?" she asked weakly. Lisa nodded. "And from what I heard, his company is considering some kind of major deal with Skyway. That's why he's on this flight." The realization hit Patricia like a physical blow. She had potentially jeopardized a major corporate account because of her prejudice, and worse, she had humiliated a highly qualified captain in the process. "What should I do?" Patricia asked, genuine panic creeping into her voice. Lisa's expression was unsympathetic. "Maybe start by treating all our crew members with the same respect regardless of what they look like." The plane began to taxi toward the runway, the engines rumbling beneath their feet. Patricia returned to her position for the safety demonstration, her mind whirling with the implications of what had happened. She went through the motions automatically, demonstrating the oxygen mask and life vest as she had thousands of times. before, but her thoughts were elsewhere. In his seat, Thomas Wilson watched the safety demonstration with polite attention, though his mind was also elsewhere. He was thinking about his meeting tomorrow with Skyway's executives. Wilson Global Enterprises had been considering several airlines for their new corporate travel package, and Skyway was just one option among many. Thomas had decided to take this flight partly to spend time with his son, but also to experience Skyway's service firsthand before making any decisions. So far, his impression was mixed. The flight attendant who had greeted him, Patricia according to her name tag, had seemed professional enough if a bit cold. But Thomas had spent decades in business, and he had developed a keen sense for people's characters. There was something about Patricia that gave him pause. As the plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky, Thomas looked out the window at the shrinking landscape below. He didn't yet know about the incident between Patricia and James earlier that morning, but he would soon, and when he did, it would change the course of events for everyone involved. In the cockpit, James guided the plane smoothly upward, feeling the familiar sense of freedom that came with leaving the ground bay. And, for now, at least, he could focus solely on the job he loved, letting all other concerns fall away like the city disappearing beneath the clouds below. The Skyway Airlines flight to San Francisco had reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began to settle in for the 5-hour journey. In the first-class cabin, Thomas Wilson adjusted his seat and opened his laptop, planning to review some documents before his meeting tomorrow. He hadn't told James he would be on this flight. He wanted it to be a surprise when they landed in San Francisco. Patricia Summers moved through the first-class cabin with practiced efficiency, offering drinks to the passengers. She approached Thomas's seat with a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What can I get you to drink, Mr. Wilson?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Thomas looked up from his laptop. "Coffee, please, black." "Right away, sir." Patricia turned to prepare the drink, her hands slightly unsteady. The weight of what had happened earlier that morning was still sitting heavily on her mind. She had treated the captain, the son of this important man, with suspicion and disrespect, and now she was serving coffee to his father, who might very well be the key to a huge corporate account for Skyway. As she returned with the coffee, Thomas closed his laptop and accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. "How long have you been with Skyway, Patricia?" he asked conversationally. Patricia was caught off guard by the personal question. 12 years, sir." "That's impressive," Thomas said. "You must have seen a lot of changes in the airline industry during that time." "Yes, quite a few," Patricia replied, trying to maintain her professional demeanor despite her growing unease. Did he know about the incident with his son? Was this casual conversation leading somewhere? "I imagine it can be challenging, dealing with different people every day," Thomas continued. His tone was friendly, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. "It has its moments," Patricia said vaguely. "But I enjoy meeting new people. Some more than others, perhaps." Thomas took a sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving her face. Patricia felt a chill run down her spine. There was something knowing in his expression, but she couldn't be sure what he meant. "We try to treat all our passengers equally," she said carefully. "And your colleagues? The pilots, the other flight attendants, the ground crew?" Thomas asked. "Do you treat them all equally too?" Now Patricia was certain he knew something. Had James called his father during the boarding process? Had someone else on the crew mentioned the incident? "Of course," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you'll excuse me, I need to check on the other passengers." Thomas nodded, allowing her to retreat. He watched her hurry away, noting the tension in her shoulders. Thomas hadn't actually known about any incident. He had simply been making conversation, perhaps with a subtle probe based on his instincts about her character. But Patricia's reaction told him there was definitely something he should know about. At the back of the first-class cabin, Lisa was restocking napkins when Patricia approached. "He knows," Patricia hissed, her face pale. "The CEO, he knows what happened with his son." "Lisa," glanced toward Thomas, who was now calmly sipping his coffee and looking out the window. Did he say that? Not directly, but he was asking questions about how I treat different people. He was fishing for something. Patricia wrung her hands anxiously. What should I do? Lisa regarded her coworker coolly. Maybe you should ask yourself why you're so worried if you didn't do anything wrong. Patricia opened her mouth to respond but was interrupted by the call button from another passenger. With a final worried glance at Thomas, she hurried to attend to it. In the cockpit, James and his co-pilot Alex were monitoring the flight systems, making small adjustments as needed. The weather was clear all the way to San Francisco, promising a smooth journey. So, Alex said casually, I hear your old man is quite the big shot in the business world. James glanced at him, surprised. How did you know about my father? Alex shrugged. Overheard some of the cabin crew talking. Apparently he's on this flight, the VIP in first class. James's eyebrows shot up in genuine shock. My father is on this flight? Thomas Wilson? You didn't know? Alex looked equally surprised. I assumed you'd arranged it. James shook his head slowly, processing this unexpected information. His father was supposed to be flying into San Francisco tomorrow for his business meetings. They had planned to meet for dinner after James checked into his hotel. He must have changed his plans, James said, more to himself than to Alex. A mix of emotions washed over him, surprise, pleasure at the thought of seeing his father sooner than expected, and then a dawning realization about what his father might have witnessed or heard about. Should we say something over the intercom? Alex suggested. Welcome aboard the CEO of Wilson Global Enterprises, that sort of thing? No, James said quickly. If he wanted everyone to know who he was, he would have said something by now. Let's just focus on the flight. Back in the first-class cabin, Thomas had put away his laptop and was now engaged in conversation with the passenger beside him, a young tech entrepreneur heading to a conference in Silicon Valley. They were discussing the latest trends in artificial intelligence, with Thomas offering insights from his company's research division. Patricia moved past them, avoiding eye contact with Thomas as she collected empty cups from other passengers. She still felt deeply uneasy, convinced that Thomas knew about her treatment of his son and was simply biding his time before saying or doing something about it. Her anxiety only increased when she saw Lisa speaking quietly to Damon near the galley, both of them occasionally glancing in her direction. Were they talking about her? About what she had done? Patricia felt increasingly isolated, as though the entire crew was aligned against her. Midway through the flight, the meal service began. Patricia moved through her section with mechanical precision, distributing trays to the first-class passengers. When she reached Thomas, she hesitated briefly before placing his meal in front of him. Thank you, Thomas said politely. Then, just as Patricia was about to move on, he added, Could I ask you something, Patricia? Patricia froze. Here it came, the confrontation she had been dreading. Yes, sir? My son, Captain Wilson, I was wondering if you've worked with him before today? The question seemed innocent enough, but Patricia felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. She could lie and say no, or she could admit to knowing him and risk opening the door to questions about their earlier interaction. I believe. I saw him this morning, she said carefully. At the staff entrance. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. I see. And how was that interaction? Patricia swallowed hard. It was brief. Just a routine check. Routine? Thomas raised an eyebrow. Would you say that's how Captain Wilson experienced it as well? The question hit Patricia like a physical blow. He did know. Somehow he knew exactly what had happened. I'm not sure what you mean, she said, her voice barely audible. Thomas's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were piercing. I think you are, Patricia. But we can discuss this another time. I wouldn't want to disrupt the service for the other passengers. With that, he turned his attention to his meal, effectively dismissing her. Patricia walked away on shaky legs, feeling as though the floor might give way beneath her at any moment. In the galley, She grabbed onto the counter for support, taking deep breaths to calm herself. Lisa found her there a few minutes later. "Patricia? Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "He knows," Patricia whispered. "He definitely knows. He asked me about the interaction with his son this morning." Lisa's expression was unreadable. "What did you tell him?" "That it was routine, but he didn't believe me." Patricia ran a trembling hand through her hair. "This is bad, Lisa. Really bad. That man's company could be worth millions to Skyway, and I've probably ruined it all." "You're worried about the company losing money?" Lisa asked incredulously. "What about the fact that you humiliated a perfectly qualified captain because of what? Because he's black?" Patricia flinched at the directness of the accusation. "That's not fair. I didn't recognize him, that's all. I was just being cautious." "Cautious?" Lisa's voice was low but intense. "When was the last time you stopped Captain Henderson for an ID check? Or Captain Schmidt? Or any other white pilot? Be honest with yourself, Patricia." The question hung in the air between them, unanswered. Deep down, Patricia knew the truth, but admitting it, even to herself, was almost impossible. She had worked for Skyway for 12 years and had always seen herself as a good person, a professional. The idea that her actions might have been driven by prejudice was deeply unsettling. The conversation was interrupted by another call button. Lisa gave Patricia one last look before heading out to answer it, leaving Patricia alone with her uncomfortable thoughts. In his seat, Thomas Wilson finished his meal, his mind working through what he had learned. He had come on this flight partly to surprise his son, and partly to evaluate Skyway's service before tomorrow's meeting. He hadn't expected to uncover what appeared to be a troubling incident involving James. Thomas was no stranger to discrimination. As a black man who had built a global business empire from the ground up, he had faced his share of prejudice over the years. He had hoped things would be different for his son's generation, but moments like this reminded him how much work still needed to be done. He thought about James in the cockpit, skillfully piloting this massive aircraft with hundreds of lives in his hands. Despite all his accomplishments, despite his uniform and credentials, he had still been treated with suspicion by Patricia. It made Thomas's blood boil, but he kept his emotions in check. There would be a time and place to address this, and he wanted to hear James' side of the story first. As the flight continued toward San Francisco, the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense. Patricia avoided Thomas's section as much as possible, delegating tasks to other flight attendants. Lisa and Damon exchanged knowing glances whenever Patricia passed by, their silence more damning than any words could have been. In the cockpit, James was still processing the news that his father was on the plane. Part of him wanted to go back and greet him, but protocol dictated that pilots remain in the cockpit except for necessary breaks. He would see his father soon enough when they landed. Approaching the halfway point, Alex noted, checking their position on the navigation display. Still smooth sailing ahead? James nodded, grateful for the uncomplicated flight conditions. His mind was already jumping ahead to San Francisco, wondering what his father was doing on this flight and what it might mean for both of them. Little did he know that his father's presence was already causing quite a stir among the cabin crew, particularly for the flight attendant who had questioned his credentials just hours before. As the plane continued its journey westward, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would change the course of several lives, and possibly the future of Skyway Airlines itself. 3 hours into the flight to San Francisco, the cabin had settled into the quiet rhythm, typical of long-haul journeys. Some passengers were sleeping, others watching movies on their screens, a few working on laptops. In first class, Thomas Wilson had just finished reviewing documents for tomorrow's meeting when he decided to do something unusual. He wanted to speak with his son. Thomas pressed the call button, and after a moment, Lisa appeared at his side instead of Patricia. "How can I help you, Mr. Wilson?" Lisa asked with a genuine smile. "I was wondering if it might be possible to speak with the captain briefly," Thomas said. "He's my son, and I'd like to surprise him." Lisa's eyes widened slightly. "I'll see what I can do, sir. We don't usually disturb the pilots during flight, but given the circumstances, I'm sure we can arrange something." "I understand the protocols," Thomas assured her. Just a brief hello would be wonderful. Lisa nodded and headed toward the front of the plane. As she passed the galley, she caught Patricia's eye and motioned for her to follow. Patricia, who had been avoiding Thomas for the past hour, reluctantly joined her. "Mr. Wilson wants to speak with his son," Lisa explained in a low voice. "I think we should let Captain Wilson know his father is on board." Patricia's face paled even further. "You want me to go to the cockpit and tell him?" "Well, you're the lead flight attendant," Lisa pointed out. "It would normally be your responsibility." Patricia knew Lisa was right, but the thought of facing James after their earlier encounter made her stomach churn with anxiety. Still, she had a job to do. With a stiff nod, she headed toward the cockpit, every step feeling like she was walking to her own execution. She knocked on the cockpit door and waited for the security procedure to be completed before it opened. James turned in his seat, his expression shifting to carefully neutral when he saw who it was. "Yes, Patricia?" he asked, his tone professional but cool. Patricia cleared her throat. "Captain Wilson, there's a passenger in first class who would like to speak with you. It's your father." James's expression softened slightly with surprise, though he had already heard from Alex that his father might be aboard. "My father? He told you he's my father?" "Yes, sir. He's in seat 2A. He said he wanted to surprise you." James exchanged a glance with Alex, who nodded encouragingly. "We're stable at cruising altitude. I can handle things here for a few minutes if you want to go say hello." James hesitated. It wasn't common practice for pilots to leave the cockpit during flight except for necessary breaks, but this was an unusual situation. "All right, I'll be brief." He unbuckled his harness and stood up, following Patricia out into the cabin. As they walked through the narrow corridor, James could feel the tension radiating from her. He wondered what his father had said to her, or if she was simply uncomfortable after their earlier encounter. In the first-class cabin, Thomas was waiting patiently, chatting with Lisa about San Francisco's weather. When he saw James approach, a broad smile spread across his face, and he stood up. "There's my boy," Thomas said warmly, opening his arms. James broke into a genuine smile, momentarily forgetting about Patricia, the morning's incident, and everything else. "Dad, what are you doing on this flight? I thought you were coming tomorrow." They embraced, Thomas clapping his son firmly on the back. "Thought I'd surprise you, catch your flight instead of taking a later one. See my son in action." Several passengers were watching the interaction with interest, and Lisa was beaming at the family reunion. Patricia, however, stood slightly apart, her face a mask of professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide her discomfort. "How did you manage to book this flight without me knowing?" James asked, still amazed by his father's appearance. Thomas chuckled. "I have my ways. Plus, I wanted to see Skyway service firsthand before my meeting with their executives tomorrow. 2 birds, 1 stone." At the mention of the meeting, Patricia visibly tensed. Lisa noticed and gave her a pointed look before addressing James. "Captain, it's nice to see you and your father together. You look so much alike." James smiled at Lisa. "Thank you, Lisa. My dad's always been my role model, though I went into flying instead of business. And made me proud every step of the way," Thomas added, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "From your first flight lesson to becoming a captain, you've earned everything through hard work and determination." The emphasis on earned wasn't lost on Patricia, who shifted uncomfortably from one foot to another. She had the distinct impression that Thomas was sending her a message. "Dad, I should get back to the cockpit," James said, conscious of his responsibilities. "But I'm so glad you're here. We'll have plenty of time to catch up in San Francisco." "Of course, son. Safety first." Thomas sat back down in his seat. "I just wanted to say hello, and maybe have a word with you and Miss Summers here when we land." He glanced meaningfully at Patricia. James looked between his father and Patricia, noting the tension. "Is everything okay?" "We can discuss it after we land," Thomas said smoothly. "You focus on flying the plane." James nodded, though his curiosity was piqued. He gave his father's shoulder a squeeze before heading back toward the cockpit, leaving Patricia standing awkwardly beside Thomas's seat. As soon as James was out of earshot, Thomas turned his full attention to Patricia. "Ms. Summers, I'd like to speak with you privately once we're on the ground in San Francisco. I think we have some important matters to discuss regarding professional conduct and respect in the workplace." Patricia's mouth went dry. "Yes, sir," she managed to say before retreating to the galley area, her legs barely supporting her. In the galley, Damon was preparing the cart for the next beverage service. He looked up as Patricia entered, immediately noticing her distress. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Patricia whispered, leaning against the counter for support. "Mr. Wilson wants to speak with me after we land. About professional conduct and respect in the workplace. He knows everything, Damon. I'm finished." Damon's expression was sympathetic, but not particularly surprised. "What exactly did you expect to happen, Patricia? You treated his son, a captain with years of experience, like he didn't belong here. Actions have consequences." Patricia felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't mean to. I was just doing my job." "Were you?" Damon asked quietly. "Or were you making assumptions based on how someone looked? Because from what I heard, you don't stop other pilots to check their IDs." The question hit Patricia like a physical blow. Deep down, she knew the truth, but admitting it meant confronting something ugly within herself, a bias she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. Damon's expression softened a bit. "Start by being honest. With Mr. Wilson, with Captain Wilson, but most importantly with yourself. And then listen. Really listen to what they have to say." Back in the cockpit, James settled into his seat, still processing the unexpected encounter. With his father, Alex looked at him curiously. "Everything okay with your dad?" Alex asked. "You seem deep in thought." James adjusted his headset. "Yeah, he's fine. It was good to see him. But there's something going on between him and Patricia. He wants to talk, to both of us after we land." Alex raised an eyebrow. "About this morning's incident, you think?" "Probably," James sighed. "Though I don't know how he found out about it so quickly." "Word travels fast," Alex said, "especially when it involves the son of a powerful CEO. Someone probably mentioned it to him during boarding." James nodded absently, his mind already racing ahead to what this conversation might entail. Throughout his career, he had dealt with incidents like the one with Patricia by compartmentalizing, by pushing forward rather than dwelling on the It was his way of coping, of not letting the constant small aggressions derail him from his goals. But having his father involved changed things. Thomas Wilson was not someone who let injustices slide, especially when it came to his family. And as the CEO of a company that Skyway was actively courting for business, his words carried significant weight. In the first-class cabin, Thomas had returned to reviewing his documents, though his mind was equally preoccupied. The brief interaction with his son had confirmed what he'd suspected. James was aware of his father's presence but hadn't seemed surprised that Thomas wanted to speak with him and Patricia after landing. That suggested James already knew Patricia had done something warranting discussion. Thomas had built his business on treating people fairly, on judging them by their merits rather than their appearance. He had instilled these values in his son, who had faced obstacles throughout his career that Thomas could only partially shield him from. Seeing the evidence of those obstacles firsthand today, on James's own flight, in his workplace, filled Thomas with a mixture of sadness and determination. The remaining hours of the flight passed in a state of suspended tension. Patricia performed her duties mechanically, avoiding Thomas's section whenever possible and delegating tasks to Lisa and Damon. The other crew members had picked up on the atmosphere, exchanging questioning glances whenever Patricia passed by, with her unusually rigid posture and forced smile. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, the weight of the impending conversation seemed to press down on everyone involved. James guided the aircraft with his usual skill, but his mind was elsewhere. Patricia secured the cabin with efficient movements that belied her inner turmoil, and Thomas sat calmly in his first-class seat, already planning exactly what he would say when they were all on the ground. The touchdown was smooth, the plane rolling along the runway before taxiing toward the gate. As the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began to stand and collect their belongings, Thomas remained seated, watching as Patricia directed the deplaning process with a tense expression. James's voice came over the intercom, thanking everyone for flying Skyway Airlines and wishing them a pleasant stay in San Francisco. The familiar words sounded strange to Patricia's ears, knowing what awaited her once the cabin was empty. As the last passenger filed out, Thomas finally stood, collecting his briefcase with unhurried movements. Patricia stood near the exit, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Lisa and Damon were busy in the back of the plane, though they kept casting concerned glances toward the front. James emerged from the cockpit, having completed his post-flight checks. He spotted his father and Patricia standing at opposite ends of the first-class cabin, the tension between them almost palpable. "Dad," James said, approaching Thomas with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Shall we talk here, or would you prefer somewhere more private?" "Here is fine," Thomas replied, his voice calm but authoritative. "Ms. Summers, would you join us, please?" Patricia moved forward stiffly, stopping a few feet away from them. She looked as though she might be sick at any moment. "First, I want to hear from both of you about what happened this morning," Thomas said, looking between James and Patricia. "James, why don't you start?" James hesitated, glancing at Patricia. He had never been one to complain or make waves, even when faced with discrimination. But his father's presence and the direct question made evasion impossible. "I arrived at the airport this morning in uniform, with my ID clearly visible," James began carefully. "Patricia stopped me at the staff entrance and asked to see my ID. She examined it very closely and made comments about not recognizing me and needing to double-check. It was uncomfortable." Thomas nodded, his expression neutral. "And this isn't standard procedure for all pilots?" "No," James admitted. "It's not. Another crew member pointed out that a white pilot had walked through just before me without being stopped at all." Thomas turned to Patricia, whose face had gone pale. "Ms. Summers, would you like to explain your actions?" Patricia swallowed hard, knowing that whatever she said next could determine the course of her career, and perhaps even Skyway's relationship with Wilson Global Enterprises. The truth was what mattered now, but finding it required confronting parts of herself she had long ignored. She began, her voice barely audible. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I stopped Captain Wilson because I didn't recognize him. I told myself it was about security, about being thorough." She paused, fighting back tears. "But the truth is, if he had been white, I probably wouldn't have questioned him at all. I wouldn't have assumed he might not belong there." The admission hung in the air between them. James looked surprised. He hadn't expected such honesty from Patricia. Thomas's expression remained unreadable. "Do you understand why that's a problem, Ms. Summers?" Thomas asked quietly. Patricia nodded, a tear finally escaping down her cheek. "Yes, it means I judged your son based on his race, not his qualifications or his uniform or his ID. It means I'm part of the problem." The realization seemed to hit her fully as she spoke the words aloud. "I'm truly sorry, Captain Wilson. My behavior was inexcusable." James was silent for a moment, processing Patricia's unexpected apology. Throughout his career, he had rarely received acknowledgement when these incidents occurred, let alone a genuine apology. "Thank you for your honesty," he said finally. "That's a good first step." Thomas nodded in agreement. "It is indeed. Recognizing our biases is the beginning of addressing them." He turned to James. "Son, has this happened before at Skyway?" James sighed. "Yes. Not always as overt, but yes." Thomas's expression darkened slightly. "And I assume you've never reported these incidents?" "What would be the point?" James asked, a hint of resignation in his voice. "It rarely changes anything, and often makes things worse for the person reporting it." Thomas turned back to Patricia. "Ms. Summers, do you think Skyway Airlines has a problem with bias in its workplace culture?" Patricia hesitated, but her moment of honesty had broken through a wall within her. Yes, she admitted. I've seen it. And been part of it. More times than I care to admit. But we don't talk about it. We pretend it doesn't exist. Thomas nodded, slowly as if coming to a decision. I appreciate your candor, Ms. Summers. Tomorrow I'm meeting with Skyway's executives to discuss a potential corporate account with my company. Wilson Global Enterprises spends millions annually on air travel for our employees. Patricia's eyes widened as the full implications hit her. Her actions hadn't just affected James, they could potentially cost Skyway a massive corporate client. However, Thomas continued, I don't believe in punishing an entire company for one person's actions, especially when that person has shown the capacity for growth and change. What I will be doing is insisting that Skyway implement a comprehensive, bias training program for all employees, with regular follow-ups and clear reporting procedures for incidents like what happened today. He turned to James. And I want you to be part of developing that program, son, if you're willing. Your experiences and insights would be valuable. James looked surprised but nodded slowly. I'd be willing to help, yes. Thomas smiled, then turned back to Patricia. As for you, Ms. Summers, I believe in second chances when people take responsibility for their actions. What happens next in your career will depend largely on what you do with this wake-up call. Will you be part of the solution going forward? Patricia wiped away another tear and straightened her shoulders. Yes, sir. I want to be. I need to be. Good, Thomas said with a nod of satisfaction. Then I suggest we all get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day. For all of us. As they prepared to leave the plane, James caught his father's eye and mouthed a silent, "Thank you." Thomas smiled and placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his pride evident in his expression. It wasn't just about James's accomplishments as a pilot. It was about the dignity and grace with which he handled adversity, qualities that Thomas hoped the rest of Skyway Airlines would soon learn to recognize and respect. The morning after, Flight SK-285 landed in San Francisco. Thomas Wilson sat in a spacious conference room on the top floor of Skyway Airlines West Coast headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the bay. But Thomas's attention was focused entirely on the group of executives seated around the table. Richard Coleman, Skyway's CEO, sat directly across from Thomas, flanked by the airline's Chief Operating Officer and Director of Corporate Relations. They had spent the last hour discussing the potential partnership between Wilson Global Enterprises and Skyway, a deal that could be worth millions in corporate travel contracts. So, as you can see, Mr. Wilson, Coleman was saying, gesturing to the presentation on the screen, Skyway can offer your company significant discounts on our transcontinental routes, priority boarding for all your executives, and dedicated check-in counters at major hubs. Thomas nodded politely, though his expression remained neutral. Very impressive, Mr. Coleman. Your proposal is competitive with what other airlines have offered us. Coleman's smile faltered slightly at the word competitive rather than better or more attractive. He leaned forward, sensing that something was off. Is there anything specific you'd like us to address, Mr. Wilson? Any concerns about the package we've presented? Thomas set down his pen and folded his hands on the table. Actually, there is something I'd like to discuss that's not in your presentation, something I experienced firsthand during my flight yesterday. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Coleman cleared his throat. I hope your flight was comfortable, Mr. Wilson. If there were any service issues— The service was adequate, Thomas interrupted. What concerns me is an incident I witnessed involving one of your employees and my son, Captain James Wilson. Coleman's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Your son is a Skyway pilot? Yes, he was the captain on yesterday's flight from Atlanta, Thomas confirmed. And yesterday morning before boarding he was stopped by a flight attendant who demanded to see his ID, despite him being in full uniform with credentials visible. Thomas proceeded to calmly relate the entire incident, including Patricia's eventual admission that she had acted based on bias rather than proper procedure. As he spoke, the faces of the executives grew increasingly concerned. When was the last time your company conducted comprehensive bias training for all employees, Mr. Coleman? Thomas asked when he had finished his account. Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We have diversity initiatives in place, of course. All employees undergo some form of sensitivity training during onboarding. Some form? Thomas repeated. That sounds rather vague. And what about ongoing training? What systems do you have in place for reporting and addressing incidents like what happened to my son? The COO, a woman named Veronica Hayes, stepped in. Mr. Wilson, I want to assure you that Skyway takes these matters very seriously. The behavior you've described is not in line with our values. Values are meaningful only when they're reflected in actions and policies, Thomas replied. My son tells me this wasn't an isolated incident. He and other employees of color have experienced similar treatment, but they rarely report it because they don't believe anything will change. Coleman's face had grown pale. I had no idea. I'm deeply sorry about what happened to your son, Mr. Wilson. We will certainly address this specific incident and the flight attendant involved. Thomas shook his head. This isn't about punishing one employee, Mr. Coleman. It's about acknowledging a systemic issue and taking concrete steps to address it. Patricia Summers was honest enough to recognize and admit her bias yesterday. That's actually a promising start. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table to Coleman. This is a proposal of my own. Wilson Global Enterprises is still interested in partnering with Skyway, but with conditions. We want to see a comprehensive bias training program implemented throughout your company, regular follow-up sessions, clear reporting procedures with actual consequences, and metrics to track improvement. Coleman opened the folder with slightly trembling hands, scanning the document inside. This is quite extensive, Mr. Wilson. So is the problem, Thomas replied evenly, and I should mention that my son has agreed to consult on the development of this program. His insights would be invaluable, don't you think? Hayes nodded quickly. Absolutely. Captain Wilson's perspective would be extremely helpful. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. I built my company on the principle that people should be judged by their skills, their work ethic, and their character, nothing else. I believe most people want to do the right thing, but unconscious biases can cloud our judgment if we don't actively work to recognize and address them. Coleman nodded, looking somewhat relieved that Thomas wasn't simply walking away from the deal. I appreciate your approach to this, Mr. Wilson. Rather than just taking your business elsewhere, you're offering us a path to improvement. It's the same chance I gave Ms. Summers yesterday, Thomas said, an opportunity to acknowledge the problem and be part of the solution. The question is, will Skyway take that opportunity? Coleman exchanged glances with his colleagues before turning back to Thomas with a determined expression. Yes, Mr. Wilson. We will. I'll have our legal team review your proposal immediately. But I can tell you now that we accept your conditions, in principle. Skyway needs to do better, and with your help we will. Thomas smiled for the first time since the meeting began. Excellent. I look forward to a productive partnership, Mr. Coleman. While Thomas was meeting with Skyway's executives, James was having breakfast with his father's assistant, Angela Chen, at their hotel. Angela had flown in the previous night to prepare for the meeting, and now she was briefing James on his potential role in the new training program. Your father was very clear about wanting you involved, Angela explained, sliding a tablet across the table to James. Here's an outline of what he's proposing to Skyway. He'd like your input before it's finalized. James skimmed through the A document, impressed by the thoroughness of his father's approach. This is comprehensive. Did he put this together last night? Angela smiled. You know your father. Once he sets his mind to something, he doesn't waste time, especially when it involves his family. James felt a rush of gratitude toward his father. Throughout his life and career, Thomas had been his strongest advocate, but always in ways that empowered James rather than fighting his battles for him. This situation was no different. Thomas was using his influence to create systemic change, with James as an active participant rather than just a beneficiary. Has he heard anything from Patricia? James asked, setting down the tablet. Not directly, Angela replied, but he did receive an email from Skyway's HR department this morning, confirming that she's been temporarily reassigned to ground duties while they review the incident. She's also volunteered to be part of the pilot program for the new training initiative. James nodded thoughtfully. Patricia's reaction yesterday had surprised him. He had expected defensiveness or denial, the usual responses when people were confronted with their biases. Instead, she had shown genuine remorse and a willingness to change. It was a small, but significant step in the right direction. Back at Skyway headquarters, the meeting was wrapping up. Thomas and Coleman shook hands, having reached an agreement in principle on both the corporate travel contract and the bias training program. "There's one more thing, Mr. Coleman," Thomas said as they walked toward the elevator. "I'd like you to consider promoting my son to senior fleet captain. Not because he's my son, but because he's earned it with his excellent record and years of service. The fact that he hasn't been promoted already while pilots with less experience have moved up suggests another area where bias may be affecting your company's decisions." Coleman looked momentarily flustered, but quickly recovered. "I'll review Captain Wilson's record personally, Mr. Wilson. If he's qualified, and I have no reason to doubt that he is, the promotion will be processed immediately." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Good. I look forward to hearing about it." As Thomas left the building, his phone rang. It was James. "How did it go?" James asked. "Very well," Thomas replied, a smile in his voice. "They've agreed to all our conditions, and I think you might be getting some good news about a promotion soon." James chuckled. "Dad, you didn't have to do that." "I didn't do anything except point out that you've earned it," Thomas said firmly. "The rest is on your merits, as it should be." "Thank you," James said simply. After a pause, he added, "Have you heard about Patricia?" "She's been reassigned temporarily," Thomas confirmed. "But more importantly, she's volunteered to be part of the initial training program. What do you think about that?" James considered the question carefully. "I think it's a positive sign. It's easy to get angry and stay angry about these incidents, but what really matters is creating change. If Patricia is genuinely willing to examine her biases and work on them, that's more valuable than punishment." Thomas felt a surge of pride in his son's maturity and compassion. "That's exactly right. Listen, I need to head to another meeting, but why don't we have dinner tonight to celebrate? The contract isn't signed yet, but it's as good as done." "Sounds great, Dad. See you tonight." 3 weeks later, James was back in the cockpit of another Skyway flight, preparing for takeoff from San Francisco to Chicago. As he went through his pre-flight checks, there was a knock on the cockpit door. His co-pilot opened it to reveal the lead flight attendant for this flight, Patricia Summers. James looked up in surprise. This was the first time he had seen Patricia since that day in Atlanta. She looked different somehow, still professional but with a more genuine demeanor. "Captain Wilson," she said, her voice steady but respectful. "I just wanted to check if you need anything before we begin boarding." "We're all set here, thank you," James replied, watching her carefully. Patricia nodded but didn't immediately leave. After a moment's hesitation, she said, "I also wanted to thank you, Captain, for giving me a chance to be part of the new training program. It's been eye-opening." James nodded, acknowledging her words. "I'm glad to hear that. How's it going so far?" "It's challenging," Patricia admitted. "Confronting your own biases isn't easy or comfortable, but it's necessary. And I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better, not just with you but with everyone." "That's all any of us can do," James said. "Keep learning, keep growing, keep trying to do better." Patricia smiled slightly, a real smile this time, not the forced one from their previous encounter. "Thank you, Captain. I'll let you get back to your preparations." As she left the cockpit, James felt a cautious sense of optimism. One conversation couldn't erase what had happened, and Patricia still had a long way to go, but it was a start, not just for her but for Skyway as a whole. His phone buzzed with a text message from his father. "How's the new senior fleet captain doing today?" James smiled as he typed his reply. "Ready for takeoff. Changes in the air." The official announcement of James's promotion had come through a week after the meeting in San Francisco. It was a recognition long overdue, based entirely on his qualifications and exemplary record. And it had coincided with Skyway's public announcement of their new comprehensive bias training program, developed in consultation with diversity experts and their own employees of color, including James. There was still much work to be done, of course. Changing a company culture didn't happen overnight, and there would inevitably be resistance and setbacks along the way. But as James guided the plane onto the runway, he felt a sense of progress, small but significant steps toward a future where everyone was judged by their abilities rather than their appearance. As the plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the clear blue sky, James thought about how a single flight had set so many changes in motion: his father's unexpected presence, Patricia's moment of honesty, Skyway's commitment to improvement. All of these elements had combined to create an opportunity for genuine change. And as the city below grew smaller and the horizon expanded before him, James felt something he hadn't felt in quite some time when thinking about his career at Skyway. Hope, not just for himself but for all the pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew who had experienced what he had experienced, for all those who deserved the same respect and recognition that had been too long in coming. The plane climbed higher, leaving the ground far behind. And somewhere below, in a training room at Skyway's headquarters, Patricia Summers was sitting with a group of her colleagues, learning to recognize and address the biases that had shaped her actions for too long. It wasn't a perfect solution, and the journey was just beginning. But it was a start, and sometimes that's all you need to change course and head toward a better destination.